Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Chris Jennings.
Today I've got Dr. Mike Brazier, and I am going to be asking some hard-hitting questions from a duck hunter's perspective. It's early to mid-October. People are up in Canada. Majority of the guys up there are field hunting right now, and I've heard some guys doing pretty well, some guys kind of getting a little shaky, getting a little concerned. But the main question that I have is, just as someone who's fascinated with ducks, obviously, and geese, what exactly are the ducks doing up there right now? What aspect of their life cycle are they in?
Yeah, this is an interesting time of year for ducks and for duck hunters, and it's I guess within the waterfowl ecology world, it's broadly defined as sort of the post-breeding period. We're sort of right now, if we're talking late September, early October, we're in this almost like a transition phase between post-breeding and migration, fall migration. And it's one of the things that I think we'll try to convey as we go through a lot of these discussions is how what waterfowl are doing at any one period of time is not independent of what they've just done, whatever kind of activity they've just come out of, and whatever activity or significant life cycle event they're about to go into are all connected. What they're doing now is preparing them for what they're about to do next. And so here we find ourselves in this post-breeding phase right before migration. Some birds are already migrating, blue-winged teal. Some of the early migrants, they're already winging their way south. Others are staging up at northern latitudes. And so I guess to frame this, to get folks a proper perspective on what we're talking about is, let's assume for the sake of this discussion that they've already completed their wing molt. Okay. Ducks will have already completed that. And so we're beyond that. Most of these ducks are already flighted.
And one thing I just wanted to clarify there was I'm mainly referencing the prairie pothole region, ducks on the prairies. I don't think if I said that clearly, just to make sure everyone knows that.
Yep. Yeah, and so there's also other things like molt migrations that will have already occurred. We'll come back to that topic on another day. That's fascinating in itself. But right now we're in this sort of staging period prior to fall migration for most of those species. And so it's a pretty straightforward time of year for the ducks. They're doing a couple of things. And one of those, at least for males, is they're replacing that drab basic plumage. As they go into that flightless mode, they drop all that bright plumage. And so right now those males are trying to change out of that drab plumage and regain that bright alternate breeding plumage. And the reason they're doing that and trying to do it as quick as possible is because they want to get ready to court the female. That's going to be starting up pretty soon. But they're not doing that right now. They're preparing for that. And so that's one of the things that they're going through. In order to do that, they need nutrients, they need proteins and things of that nature to replace those feathers. They also need energy to fuel that process. The other really important thing that they're doing is just preparing themselves for migration. And we all know that these birds fly long distances, and that migratory flight is an energetically costly activity. So that's really one of their primary focuses is gaining enough fuel reserves, if you will, to fuel that migration. Their number one goal is to eat now. Of course, they want to survive too, right? But they're eating. They're seeking out and using those habitats that have an abundance of high energy foods, and they're acquiring some proteins in the process. And the one thing to also keep in mind is when we look across waterfowl, we have to take into consideration all the different species and how their feeding habits and their desired habitats differ. Like for some species, mallards, pintails, even widgeon to some extent, they're gonna zero in on some of those grain fields.
They're hitting the wheat and the barley,
the wheat,
peas.
Barley, the peas, chickpeas, garbanzo beans. All those field peas is another really highly valued type up there, food item that they go after, and so you'll see them pouring into those. But there are also those species that don't field feed so readily. They're what we might call our obligate wetland species, the blue-winged teal, the Green-winged teal, to some extent, they're actually one of those species that will field feed, but they'll also take to wetlands quite a bit. But gadwall, shovelers, and then, of course, your diving ducks as well. They're not really field, but they're all doing the same thing. They're seeking out those high-energy foods, those wetlands that provide, or fields or dry fields that provide those high-energy foods. And it's this activity that we refer to, ornithologists refer to as, and I guess just ecologists in general, hyperphagia, with hyper sort of meaning a sense of heightened, and phagia means to eat, so hyperphagia. They're eating a lot. That's really what they're trying to do, is acquire as many calories and nutrients as they can to complete that molt, and then to pack on the fat so that they can make it south once they finally do start to migrate.
Be the first to know when ducks are on the move. Sign up for DU's waterfowl migration email alerts and receive ongoing in-depth updates on the latest habitat conditions, weather changes, and hunting reports for your flyway. Visit ducks.org/migration alerts.
It's just like like you see on Twitter and Instagram when the fat bear syndrome, the fat bear time of year, September, you see these big pictures of big fat bears who are just stockpiling food.
It's the same concept. And it happens with fish as well. As they're about to go into winter, they need these fat stores to either withstand the cold temperatures or fuel migration. And that's one thing that we've seen through various studies, is that as you go from October to December, body masses of various duck species, waterfowl species will increase, demonstrating that they're packing on the fat in anticipation of that migration. So that's really what they're after. Interestingly, we can talk about this sometime later. Once they get to about December, there seems to be a decline in that body mass, and there's some sort of evolutionarily or some adaptation for that. And like I said, we can talk about that a little bit later on.
You got
another
mentioned,
episode.
And I'll just go back to mention, hunters who are up in Canada now, they're seeing huge flocks of mallards, pintails, like you said, maybe widgeon, even potentially green wings who are feeding in fields, geese the same way. But then look in the other direction, there could be big flocks of gadwalls, and they're working the wetland, these little isolated wetlands or large wetlands, where divers as well. And that's kind of what people are seeing. This is the process. Now, we've all seen these big flocks, but this is a good example for, our listeners out there. And they're looking at it and they can recognize exactly what these ducks are doing, exactly. And I think that's a good point, just to point out that when you're out there looking in big flocks of birds, that's what they're doing.
Yep.
And that's great. Now, we did not touch on geese.
Yep.
Geese are probably doing the same exact thing,
Geese
just
are
a little bit different way.
Yeah, they are. They're going to be doing exactly the same thing, but they are going to be much more attracted to those agricultural fields. It's the same thing. They're putting on reserves, putting on fat reserves to fuel their migration, and so that's. You want to be, if you're out hunting birds, and this is pretty constant throughout the non-breeding period. You want to be where the birds are, where the birds want to be. In this time of year, especially, they want to be where the food is rich, where the food is energy dense. Whether we're talking gadwall, teal, geese, they're all kind of after the same thing, is a lot of food. And so, as they go through this sort of pre-migration phase, they're going to put on those fat reserves, and then another topic that we can talk about later on is kind of what happens right before they migrate. It's termed Zugenruhe. It's a German word. It means migratory restlessness. It's a phenomenon. It's pretty interesting, actually, how they discovered it, how they tested for it, and confirmed it experimentally. But it's this phenomenon where birds get restless. They literally get really antsy and right before they're about to migrate, and we can dig into some of the details on that and what controls it and kind of what triggers the transition from this hyperphagia to Zugenruhe, and then the next
and it's
step
probably weather
is,
related too as well. I mean, is that kind of offset, or can it be?
It's probably going to be related to that. What stimulates it at any particular point in time. I'm not certain on where the science is on that. We can look into that.
We'll have to do a completely separate show on Zugenruhe.
Right. But it's a pretty fascinating concept. I've never actually witnessed a group of birds engaging in this kind of antsy, erratic, and I shouldn't say erratic, but this sort of restless behavior, but it's pretty interesting. And so then if you observe that, then if they're not there the next day, well, they took off.
Yeah.
They migrated.
Well, that's awesome. Well, I appreciate it. I hope everyone learned a lot, about what they're seeing, people up on the prairies. Obviously, down here, we're still waiting on them down here, but, now everyone knows exactly what they're seeing as far as the life cycle of birds, and even some Zugenrue in there.
The Zugenrue and Hyperphagia. And so for those of us that are still down south waiting on the birds to migrate, we can engage in our own form of Hyperphagia as we wait out the hot summer. It feels like it's still summer, the hot summer and fall days in our own form of Hyperphagia as we watching college football and NFL and whatever else might entertain it.
I'm down with Hyperphagia right now. I appreciate it, Mike. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.